The objective of this podcast is to engage policy professionals in debates over thought-provoking and sometimes sensitive topics. We aim to bring those professionals together in a way that does not feed into the tribalist narrative plaguing our society today. It is my hope, and the hope of all involved in this endeavor, that by allowing these ideas to contend and challenge each other with mutual respect, everyone who listens will learn a new appreciation for something previously not considered.
The opinions and views of all guests do not necessarily reflect the views of the Knowledge Problem or of anyone involved in its production.
Hello and welcome to the Knowledge Problem podcast. My name is Dominic Malusi. Today's episode is a debate on reparations for slavery between Walter Block and David Horowitz. I hope you enjoy listening to today's debate. Hello everyone, I'm very glad we can come together and have this important conversation. This debate has a motion. The motion is reparations for slavery are unjustified. Arguing the affirmative, we have David Horowitz. David is an American conservative writer. He is a founder and president of the think tank, the David Horowitz Freedom Center, editor of the center's publication FrontPage Magazine, and director of Discover the Networks. David has also founded the organization Students for Academic Freedom. Thank you, David, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Arguing the negative, we have Walter Block. Walter is an American Austrian School economist. He currently holds the Harold E. Wirth Eminent Scholar Endowed Chair in Economics at the J.A. Butt School of Business at Loyola University New Orleans and is a senior fellow at the Ludwig von Mises Institute in Auburn. Thank you, Walter, for joining us.
I'm delighted to be here with you and David.
Wonderful. So I'm going to just recognize that we are doing this via Skype, and it will be on. There should be a video available as well as an audio recording available. So, and I will also be holding up signs when there is limited time. So I have 2 minutes left, 1 minute left, 30 seconds left, and then 1 minute left as well. So get that ready. And then, so for the first round, we have opening statements. I'd like to give David the floor to make the case in the affirmative of reparations for slavery are unjustified. Now you have 6 minutes. You may take the floor.
Before David starts, let me just make sure you're taping now, right?
I am taping now, yep.
I'd like to modify that to reparations for slavery 150 years after the fact are unjustified. Reparations was rejected by the civil rights movement in the 1960s by all three major civil rights organizations because it was divisive. And also because once the Civil Rights Acts were enacted by majorities in Congress, there is no real opposition to helping the African American population in the country that needs help. There's no political force of any significance that would oppose that. Reparations for slavery 150 years after the fact is racist. It's divisive in such an extreme way that it will generate racial resentment against blacks if it were ever passed. And it's part of the, leftist divisive antagonism. It's anti-American. The wrong government is being sued. If you want to sue a government responsible for slavery, you sue the Confederacy, which obviously doesn't exist anymore. You don't sue the government that freed the slaves. Remember that the United States government, which was created in 1776 through 1787, but let's rest with one date, 1776, was born with a radical proposition, unheard of in 3,000 years that slavery has been all over the globe, that all men are created equal and they're endowed by their creator with an inalienable right to liberty. And it was about 87 years after that, that at the cost of 350,000 Union lives, mainly white lives, there were blacks who fought for the North in the Civil War, but it was mainly white Union soldiers gave their lives, and a president did too, to free the slaves. Only an anti-American radical could endorse the idea of seeking reparations from that government, and particularly 150 years after the fact. Who is going to pay these reparations? Hispanics, who are, the Hispanic migration to this country is not that old, who are struggling to put food on the table for their children. They should pay reparations to Oprah Winfrey, who's a billionaire, or LeBron James, who's also probably a billionaire, or Shaquille O'Neal. It's ludicrous. 80% of the American population is descended from people who migrated to this country after 1880, long after the slaves were freed. Should something have been done at the time? Sure. I'm not going to argue against that. Of course, that it should have been done to the liberated slaves. There was a military order for 40 acres and a mule, but the politicians didn't do it, and that's too bad. But you can't make that up 150 years later by asking, some recent immigrant who's, struggling to put bread on the table for his or her children to pay reparations to African Americans in this country when, I think it's over 50% of African Americans are well in the middle class. And we finally achieved a nation where there is tolerance, inclusion, and equality. I think that's basically what I have to say about this. I think it's just a terrible idea. It will divide the country. It will create resentment against black people. And also there's the whole welfare system, for crying out tears. There's been $22 or $3 trillion spent since the Great Society on welfare. It hasn't lifted anybody out of poverty. We have the same levels of poverty, maybe more, because the welfare system is such a destructive system to black people and to anybody who's a recipient. You have all these fatherless children now. But there's been enormous compensation. This is if you're African American, you should thank God that you're in this country. It was terrible the way they were brought here, but they weren't enslaved. This is the bottom line, by white people. They were enslaved by black Africans who sold them at slave auctions to Europeans.
Okay. Thank you, David, for your opening. I want to give now the floor to Walter Block, who will be arguing in the negative. You have 6 minutes.
I once sent David this article of mine in the Human Rights Review. It's entitled something like "On Reparations to Blacks for Slavery." And I complimented on him on his magnificent undermining critique of a guy named Randall Robinson. And his article was, what was it called? The Latest Civil Rights Disaster, 10 Reasons Why Reparations for Slavery Are a Bad Idea for Black People and Racists Too. I thought David did a magnificent job in mopping the floor with Randall Robinson and about 5 other Black studies types of people who are saying that we should have reparations for Blacks. On the other hand, I don't think he lays a glove on the libertarian case, which is a very different kind of a case for reparations. Before I get into it, let me just say that I don't believe in statute of limitations on justice. 150 years ago, 1,500 years ago, 15,000 years ago, I don't care. Justice is justice, and we should pursue justice no matter what the time period is. Now, it's true there's a natural statute of limitations, namely, in my belief, the burden of proof is on he who would like to end or change property titles. So the burden of proof is always on the person who wants to change things. And the further back in history you go, the harder it is. But if we can prove it, well, then the libertarian view on property rights is, if you steal something, you should be able to pay it back. Let me give you an example. I have here a wristwatch. And let's suppose that my great-grandfather stole it from David's great-great-grandfather. And it's even got a picture of David's great-great-grandfather on the back. So there's no question that this is David's great-great-grandfather's watch. And my great-grandfather, the thief, gave it to my grandfather, who gave it to my father, who gave it to me. And this might have been 150 years ago. I don't care how long ago it was. David is now suing me for this watch. Should he get it? You darn tootin' he should get it. It's his great-grandfather's watch, and we assume that if my great-grandfather didn't steal it from his great-grandfather would have given it to his grandfather, who would have given it to his father, who would have given it to him. So justice requires that that David's lawsuit against me succeed. Well, what happened in slavery? What happened in slavery is that a bunch of black people, David is quite correct, in Africa stole some labor from black slaves, and then they sold them to the white slave owners in the U.S. And the white slave owners pursued to steal labor. They did much worse than steal labor, but at least they stole labor. And the plantations were built up mainly with black, what did they say, sweat, tears, and I forget what the word is, blood, sweat, and tears. The black blood, sweat, and tears went into those plantations. And at the end of slavery, what should have happened is that they should have had those plantations. Instead, the plantations went to the white kids, the children of the white slave owners, and the black people got nothing. So now there's some plantation in the middle of South Carolina, in the middle of Louisiana, and it's owned, say, by a white great-great-grandson. And here's a black guy in the middle of Harlem who can now prove that his great-great-grandfather was a slave on the plantation in South Carolina, say. And I think that if the black person in Harlem can demonstrate this, then he should get 1/50th of that plantation, assuming that there were 50 slaves. I'm just doing this for simple numbers. So I think that David's critique against Randall Robinson and the people who say, well, all whites owe a debt to all blacks is obvious nonsense. And I agree with him, and I think he's done a magnificent job in undermining that. But I don't think that he lays a glove on the libertarian view. The libertarian view is we favor private property rights. And if somebody steals something, well, one thing that should happen, my great-grandfather should go to jail for stealing David's great-grandfather's watch. But it's a little too late for justice. We can't do that. And I think that we should do a lot more against my great-grandfather, the thief. Notice I'm making my side the thief, not David's side. I want to be diplomatic here. So libertarian punishment theory requires that we do a lot more. It's pretty draconian that we do a lot more against thieves. But at the very least, the thief shouldn't be giving it to his son and his grandson and his great-grandson. I'm the great-grandson. Rather, I should be giving the watch to David because in the ordinary course of events, David's great-grandfather would have kept the watch and, as I said, given it to his son, and then David would have got it eventually. I rest my case.
Okay, thank you. So now we're going to start rebuttals. I will give the floor now to David. You may respond to Walter's argument, and then you have 3 minutes.
Yeah. The problem with Walter's argument is this is not reparations. We're not talking about individual cases where somebody whose great-great-great-grandfather, whatever, was a slave on a particular plantation, goes after the present-day owner of it. I suspect the courts would not recognize that principle anyway. The fact of the matter is there are no slaves alive today. There are no children of slaves alive today. And what the reparations movement amounts to is it's going to tax people who are completely innocent. My grandparents, when there was slavery in America, can't even trace my family back that far. But I assure you, they were being vamped on as Jews by Cossacks in the Pale of Settlement or some similar ghetto. Why should why should I pay reparations? The real problem here is what this means in the real world. And that is it's a lot of resentment on the part of blacks. We're now living in a distressing era when the New York Times is one of the leading racist publications. Used to be the gold standard in journalism. They've launched a 1619 project to say that America is essentially was created in 1619, which is a lie. Slavery wasn't even legal in the Virginia colony in 1619. They chose it because the first 20 Africans who happened to be indentured servants, not slaves, were shipped to America then. But anti-white racism is rampant in this country. It's taught in the K-12 schools. It's taught in the colleges. The Democratic Party has embraced this racist ideology, identity politics, that if you're white, you're guilty before the fact. If you're black, you're innocent even after the facts. And any move to have reparations, however, I'm not a legal expert, so I suspect it wouldn't even go in a court of law if an individual brought such a suit. But I appreciate the intellectual energy that went into making that argument. But I don't think that's part of what our real world is anymore. I'm sorry to say. I wish there was justice. I don't think it's just to have people who never owned a slave, who have suffered probably all kinds of difficulties and maybe oppressions themselves, to pay people who were never slaves and who may be billionaires.
Yep. All right. So I will give Walter time to respond. I will. How about 3 minutes and 15 seconds? Is that good?
Sure.
Okay.
If the debate was the reparations movement case for reparations for slavery is unjust, then I would agree entirely with David. I applaud him, as I say, for ripping to shreds Randall Robinson's view and the other black racists' view. But that wasn't the debate. The debate was reparations for slavery 150 years ago. I accept that amendment is unjust. And reparations for slavery 150 years ago is not unjust on an individual basis. Who says that I have to defend the movement? I don't defend the movement. I agree with David about resentment and anti-white racism. I agree with him that the courts would not tolerate this, but I don't give a good goddamn about the goddamn courts. I'm interested in justice. And if the courts don't support this, then they're against justice. And it doesn't matter how rich the plaintiff is. It could be, Shaquille O'Neal or a rich person. David could be very rich. David could be somebody that Bernie hates, a millionaire or a billionaire, and still his case would be just. He should get this watch. And yes, there are no kids alive now whose parents were slaves, but there are kids alive now whose great-great-grandparents were slaves. So the case, I think, is very clear. And I agree with David again on the New York Times. Their policy on 1619, it just foments racism. But I don't see any case for a statute of limitations, certainly not a legal one, only natural statute of limitations. The further back in history, the harder it is to prove anything. But if Shaquille O'Neal can prove that his great-grandfather was a slave on the XYZ plantation, I don't care how rich he is. Just because you're rich doesn't mean you can't be a good plaintiff. I'm surely David would retract that idea. I mean, you certainly don't want to say that rich people can't sue justly just because they're rich. I think that's a problem. So in a sense, we are passing each other as ships in the night. I think I agree with David on the reparations movement case, but I'm hoping that he'll agree with me on the individual case, that if there's some black guy, whether he's a poor guy in Harlem or he's Shaquille O'Neal or LeBron James, and these are very rich black people, if their great-grandfather was a slave on the plantation, they are entitled to what their great-grandfather should have got in 1865 and didn't get. And just because, and also black people should be able to sue black people in Africa. If there's some African king who initially enslaved the person, well, then forgetting about the fact that, we're crossing the Atlantic Ocean, that this guy in Harlem or LeBron James should be able to sue a black guy, or the great-grandchildren of the black guy who got the money to sell the slave to the Americans.
All right, thank you. Now I want to move on to the posed questions round. I want to give the opportunity to David to offer a question or a challenge to Walter's views. I want to give you 2 minutes to do that.
I don't think Walter and I are far apart or at all, even, although I think this kind of issue of justice. What about the Union soldiers who gave their lives? What are they owed? I can't think my way into this legalistic argument. As I said, maybe the courts would say, sure, there's justice in the kind of reparations that Walter is talking about. I don't have a big disagreement over that. My interest is in the political situation in America today. And I think what the left has set out to do by demanding reparations for slavery is to alienate Black America from America, which is a very, very dangerous thing and very destructive to African Americans, but also destructive to America. And I'm at war with them and will continue to be at war with them. And I don't really have a challenge to pose to Walter, because he's making an argument which, would either stand. I mean, sure, the court system in America is probably the greatest injustice system. If you've ever been involved in any legal disputes, you would know what I mean. So this is a kind of an intellectual puzzle, and I would be an interested spectator if Walter brings a suit, or somebody were to bring such a suit. And I think, Walter, I never got the article that you sent. It probably disappeared in my, I don't recognize that at all. I mean, it may be my aging memory, but it's probably disappeared in my organization. And as for Bernie Sanders, he could buy me many times over.
Well, David and I have a lot in common. We're of the similar age, and I think our grandparents came from the similar place, namely Russia and Poland or Germany or somewhere like that. We have a lot in common, and in a sense, we really have no argument. I hate to disappoint our audience, but we really agree. I certainly agree enthusiastically with David's political interest in stopping this political thing, because it says that, all whites owe all blacks reparations, which is, nonsense. His and my great-grandparents came here in, 1880 or 1910 or somewhere like that, long after slavery was over. So why do we owe anything to anyone? And then there are black people who came here in the last 10 years. Why are they owed anything from white Americans? And David makes a good point about the soldiers, what are they owed? So we really have no disagreement on the reparations movement case. Very bad. And on the other hand, I think David regards what I'm saying as sort of an intellectual puzzle. But, Okay, it's an intellectual puzzle or an intellectual sort of exercise. Okay, I'll agree with him on that. But still, as a libertarian, and I think David would agree with me on this, that we want to promote justice, and justice means return of stolen property, no matter how many years have passed. So I don't really see any problem. So my question to David is, I agree with you. Do you agree with me?
Also, we should mention there were 3,000 black slave owners, not to mention Indian slave owners. And by Indian, I mean Native American. So,
and black slave owners. There were black slave owners too. So it's not a white-black thing.
Yes.
So we're really agreed?
Yeah, my concern, and I know Walter would agree with me on this, is that America is this incredible gift to black people. Slavery existed in Africa for 1,000 years before a white person ever set foot there. And it's only because of America that slavery, vanished in this hemisphere and is under siege. Not enough in this world. There are still so many slaves. It's terrible. But there's still slavery in Black Africa.
That's true. Not only blacks are benefiting from being in a semi-capitalist country, but also Jews. Milton Friedman, who I think David and I would support in most things, once said that the capitalist system has been more beneficial to Jews than pretty much any other group, or very, very beneficial to Jews. And look at the way Jews are voting. Blacks are voting 95% for people that David and I would disagree with, and Jews are too.
This next election.
Well, who knows what's going to happen in the next election if Bernie gets in. But I think, I hate to ruin the debate, but I think David and I have much more in common than we diverge. And the only reason that we're having a debate is because, as I said, we're sort of passing each other in ships in the night. David is making a certain point with which I fundamentally and totally and enthusiastically agree. And I'm making a point that I think he agrees with, but he thinks it's sort of irrelevant to the political situation. And I agree with that. It's not really relevant. It's sort of an intellectual exercise.
Every Democrat running for president has endorsed reparations. It's a tragedy.
Reparations of the sort that you're opposed to and that I'm opposed to,
yes.
But not reparations of the sort that I favor and that I'm trying to hornswoggle you into favoring also. Very individual. Now, how many people would this be? 10, 20 people? I don't know. Maybe nobody. But it's of a theoretical important interest to say that there's nothing wrong with reparations per se. It's only something wrong with the movement reparations where they want to say all whites owe all blacks something, which is crazy.
Let me say another thing too on the economic studies of slavery in this country. And I forget what the figure is, but it's only 10% of the labor that was lifted, that was stolen, as you like to put it, because a slave had to be housed and fed and clothed. And 90% of free wage laborers in the 19th century, 90% of their income went to just that: shelter, clothing. It's the terrible thing about slavery is the indignity of having one person own another. I think Madison said it very eloquently. But anyway, next time you want to do reparations, get some blowhard.
It's funny. We're sort of deteriorating from we're now having an amiable conversation, no more timing or anything. But I wanted to run, one more intellectual thing by you. Two things. I once had a debate with Milton Friedman on this, and what he said, quite correctly, was land is only 10% of the GDP. So why are we fighting about land? Why have land reparations? And I said, well, because of justice. And, I had trouble getting through on that. But I do want to try another intellectual curiosity with David. He mentioned inalienable rights, and I favor a certain type of slavery, for which I got into a great deal of trouble with the New York Times. They libeled me on this. Here's the scenario. My son, horrible, God forbid, has a horrible disease. And it'll cost $10 million to solve it. I don't have $10 million. But David over here has long wanted to have me on his plantation, and he could whip me if I don't give him good economics lessons or pick cotton or whatever. So we make a deal. I say, David, give me 10 million. I will give it to my son's doctors. I'll benefit because I value his life more than my freedom. You'll benefit because you value my servitude more than the 10 million. You're very rich. I'm promoting you into a billionaire status. So I think that a voluntary slavery contract would be legitimate. I gave this to the New York Times in an interview, and they started saying I favored actual slavery, whereas I have a long paper trail for favoring reparations for slavery, so I can hardly favor coercive slavery. But here's another intellectual kind of curiosity. Do you also favor the right, will you give up on your inalienableness, namely that I have a right to sell myself into slavery? If I own it, I should be able to sell it.
Right to liberty, you have a right to do that too.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
If you have a right to liberty, you have that right too to give it up.
That's right. If I have a right to liberty, I have a right to sell it. So we
really,
both,
what you're talking about is really indentured servitude, where people, in exchange for passage on the ship to get here, gave a 7-year contract.
I'm not talking about a 7-year contract, and I'm giving you the right to even kill me because, you're a tough slave master. This is not indentured slavery. This is indentured servitude. This is actual slavery, but on a voluntary basis.
Yeah, I don't think I'd like to legalize murder.
Well, but then my son dies, and I'd rather give my life up for him. And if you wouldn't want to legalize it, my son dies, and my son's life is more important to me than my own life. So if you don't want to legalize, you're a rotten kid. You're not a libertarian.
Why do I feel like we're a chapter in the Talmud at this point?
Well, I think for good reason. The Talmud is fun. This is sort of higher libertarian theory, and I'm trying to drag you kicking and screaming into this way of thinking. And I realize it's not politically acceptable, and it's certainly not relevant. And I know that your career is based on political relevance. Mine is, I'm a professor. I'm supposed to, I'm sorry?
You're a professor, that's right.
I am. I have to do this stuff or they'll kick me out.
All right.
Well, it was great having a debate with you. I don't think we have to summarize anything. We've sort of covered. Do you agree with me on that, David?
Yeah.
Okay, great. It's been lovely. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Me too.
Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it. You guys can come together and have this conversation. So thank you, David Horowitz. Thank you, Walter Block.
And I will send you this.
Okay.
All right.
Take care, guys.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Knowledge Problem Podcast. If you liked the episode, please subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. Also, consider following our social media accounts to stay up to date on new developments in the show and to share your opinions. We'd like to give one final thank you to our guests today for taking the time to engage in productive conversation. We would like to also thank our sponsors, Young Voices.